Good evening. Thanks for being here. I'm Lisa Krauser. I'm the Edward W. Kane Executive Director here at the Concord Museum. Tonight is our annual Earth Day Forum presented in partnership with the Thoreau Society, and our topic tonight is Thoreau's pencils with historian Augustine Sedgwick in conversation with Robert A. Gross. So we were lucky to connect with Augustine when he came to the museum in 2022 to research our collection. What yielded from that time spent at the museum and his subsequent research is his forthcoming essay on the history of Thoreau's pencils and their ties to slavery that will be the cover story in the summer's edition of The American Scholar. Augustine's research aided us in the development of our new special exhibition, What Makes History? New Stories from the Collection, in which we asked visitors to consider what materials are used to tell stories. An example of this being through the lens of pencils made by the Thoreau family's rival manufacturers, the Monroes. So if you haven't seen the exhibition, I encourage everybody to come and see it. It's really wonderful. Our curators are here as well tonight who put the exhibition together, so thank you. Augustine Sedgwick is the author of Coffeeland and the forthcoming book Fatherhood, An Intimate History. He earned his doctorate at Harvard University, and his research on the global history of capitalism, work, food, sex, and masculinity has received fellowships from the American Council of Learned Societies, the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation, the Jackman Humanities Institute of the University of Toronto, and the Project on Justice, Welfare, and Economics at Harvard. Augustine has known tonight's moderator, Robert A. Gross, since his freshman year at William & Mary. So Bob doesn't really need an introduction in this town, but he deserves an introduction. So Bob is the James L. and Shirley A. Draper Professor of Early American History Emeritus at the University of Connecticut. He's the author of The Minutemen and Their World, which won the Bancroft Prize, Books and Libraries in Thoreau's Concord, 1988, and most recently, The Transcendentalists and Their World, which received Massachusetts Historical Society's Peter J. Gomes Book Prize. With Mary Kelly, he is the co-editor of An Extensive Republic, Print, Culture, and Society in the New Nation, 1790 to 1840. A former assistant editor of Newsweek, he has written for such periodicals as Esquire, Harper's Magazine, the Boston Globe, and the New York Times, and his essays have appeared in the American Scholar, the New England Quarterly, Raritan, and the Yale Review. So thank you also to the Thoreau Society for co-sponsoring tonight's forum. It's great to see so many members of the Society in the room tonight, and also tuned into the live stream from across the country. And please join me in welcoming Augustine Sedgwick and Bob Gross.
Well, thank you all for coming out. My job here is to be a moderator, conduct a discussion with Augustine, and also not to remind him of seminars at William & Mary. Actually, back in spring 1998, while I was teaching at the College of William & Mary, I introduced an American Studies seminar on Emerson and Thoreau, subtitled Individualism in American Culture. That was the first and only time that I offered that course at William & Mary. The subject was perhaps not as well suited to the undergraduate constituency that I had found for culture and community, Emerson, Dickinson, and Thoreau at Amherst College. Nor was it perhaps as popular as another course I taught at William & Mary on the world of Thomas Jefferson. The Virginians knew their expansive limits, and it's not necessarily the case that New England Transcendentalists were perfectly welcome. But luckily for me, in this course, was at least one New Englander, a native of Maine, Augustine Sedgwick, who helped me keep it going. And he stood out from his peers for his ambition and inventiveness. I think you were second semester sophomore. Freshman in that course. Well, he struck me as mature enough to be a sophomore. And he wrote papers on such topics that he came up with as elegant Thoreau and an age of introspection. In that paper, he compared the life of a teenager in Concord, Martha Prescott, in the mid-1830s, based on her diary, with the fictional protagonist played by Claire Danes of the short-lived TV series My So-Called Life. And so his essays were bold and imaginative, anticipating the writing he's been doing ever since. And the seminar forged a bond between us. He went on to major in American Studies, graduating summa cum laude, and he also worked for me as a research assistant, organizing and ordering my research files. His assistance helped to keep the transcendentalists in the world on track. Our careers have been entangled ever since. And he went on to do his PhD in the history of American civilization at Harvard, working with Walter Johnson, who had been my advisee at Amherst College. So I felt like I managed not only to have an academic son, but grandson in the same person. His book, Coffeeland, One Man's Dark Empire and the Making of Our Favorite Drug, is a remarkable work that combines his journalistic sense for important topics and themes and an accessible literary style with deep historical research. What he shows us in that book is how coffee helped transform and make the modern world, immiserating masses of people in Central America, privileging a very few, and turning the rest of us into addicts of the drug known as coffee, and reorganizing modern time and work around such things as coffee breaks. He's got a book forthcoming, still finishing up, on the history of fatherhood, which maybe will sneak somewhere into today's discussion. But his topic for today, pencils, takes another object, a consumable in everyday life, and gives us its deep history. So I can see why coffee comes with you. But why pencils?
Well, thanks, Bob, for that question and the introduction and the 25 years. I'm sure that everyone who speaks here says some version of this, but it does bear repeating because it's true. And that Bob did an amazing thing, does an amazing thing. And 25 years ago, when I was 18 years old, he took me seriously. And that cannot have been easy. But since then, he's been a really remarkable mentor and teacher and friend who really has upheld those standards of high standards, not only for ideas and work, but also for kindness. And that's really special and truly appreciated. And I also really appreciate the opportunity to be at the museum. Thank you, Alice, and thank you, Lisa, and thank you, Reed, and the rest of the staff. It's really wonderful to be here and have the chance to present this to you, which is something that I'm really excited about, and I hope you will be too, and I'll hope to hear your thoughts. This work on Thoreau's pencil, it comes out of my book on fatherhood, actually, a little self-promotion. Watch out for it.
This is the Coffeeland, by the way.
Spring of 2025, fatherhood. Thoreau's pencil will not be in that book, but this material comes out of that book. I started with Emerson. I was interested in Emerson as a father. And what I learned very quickly is that self-reliance is in a way about fatherhood. I started to think that when I noticed the epigraphs at the top of it. And there are three, and the third one is some verse that Emerson wrote himself. And the first line of that verse is, "Cast the bantling on the rocks." Now, I had to look it up. It means bantling is baby, especially a boy, an infant boy. Emerson began working on the material that became self-reliance very shortly after the birth of his son, Waldo. During the time that he developed that essay, Waldo was constantly in his study. And I thought that essay is really about Emerson trying to answer the question of how to raise a son in the context of the Panic of 1837, in the larger context of the market uncertainty that defined that age. And his idea was, cast the bantling on the rocks. Throw him out there. See what happens. Let him fend for himself. Right? And what I became interested in, okay, well, if Emerson is suggesting this, under what circumstances is he having these ideas? Like, how is he getting to this conclusion? What was he thinking about when he wrote the essay? What allowed him to write the essay? And it turns out, of course, that what allowed Emerson to be a writer, to write Self-Reliance about casting the bantling on the rocks, was the inheritance that he got from the estate of his first wife, Ellen. Emerson's inheritance that he got from his deceased first wife, Ellen, allowed him to develop this theory of cast the bantling on the rocks. And not only that, but I also learned that the source of Ellen's inheritance, as Emerson knew, was her father, Beza Tucker. And Emerson was well aware that Beza Tucker was what he called a merchant of Boston, who dealt in West Indies goods. And I'm making air quotes because those are euphemisms for slave-produced commodities and dealers in slave-produced commodities. And so I thought, at the very least, it's a little rude to write an essay about self-reliance that's subsidized and funded and made possible by the inheritance you gained from your wife's slave commodity trading family. At very least, that's a little rude. Why did no one ever, but this is not something that people mention about Emerson, why did no one ever raise this issue with him? And I could only conclude that it was because it wasn't that unusual. That was true of everyone in his circle. There's the fact that he funded his literary career from the profits of this slave-derived inheritance was absolutely typical. Everyone at the time was doing it. And then I thought, but surely not Thoreau. Well, actually, it turns out that if you want to make pencils, if you're a family in the 1820s and 30s and 40s and you want to make pencils and you want to have a good pencil business that competes with the best pencil businesses in the country and even with the best pencil businesses in Europe, then you have to do one thing above all. You have to get good red cedar. And the only place you can get that good red cedar is from what were then slave states, especially those slave states around the Gulf of Mexico, right, which, of course, were claimed by the United States through a series of wars against Native Americans and then against Mexico, in protest of which Thoreau went to jail. So how do we make sense of all those things at once? And about which time in jail he wrote what is arguably the most influential abolitionist essay ever written. Those are the questions of the essay.
So, Thoreau's example might be one admonitory warning about going into the family business. There's probably more than one person in this room who had a parent who said, I think you should go into the family business. Whatever your college professors tell you, you really need to help out at home. So, this was Thoreau's father's business. So he had himself ancestors who had held slaves, which he never mentioned. So what was it like for Thoreau to have to feel the pressures of going into the family business?
I think that Thoreau did everything he could to avoid it. I think to a great extent, and there's evidence of this in his earliest writing. In fact, in the commencement speech that he gave at Harvard University when he was given an award for finishing high in his class, he gave a speech in which he scorned men who spend all day scraping together gilded piles of dust, exactly like his father was doing in the family pencil factory to make the graphite into pencil leads. I think he was desperate to avoid this pencil trade. Unfortunately for him, his family needed the help, and he was really good at making things. The Thoreau made, between after he left teaching, following a very short stint in the classroom in Concord, he did go to work in his family pencil factory, and he made enormous contributions to the family business. I think it was because of Thoreau's contributions that he made that the Thoreau family pencil enterprise developed from something that was doing okay, fairly well, a local concern that was well recognized with awards and locally, into what has to be called the best pencils in the United States in the 1840s. I mean, the Thoreau family made the best pencils in America in the 1840s, and the reason they did so was Henry. And I think that at the same time as he made these really important contributions to his family business, he was pretty desperate to get away from it. I think it's a motivation for going to Walden. I think it's a motivation for becoming a surveyor. I think it's a kind of unacknowledged or unexplored motive in his life, was trying to get out of the pencil factory, even as he contributed to it, and even as his father was implicitly kind of asking him to come back. I mean, it's hard to tell from this image, but of course, the Thoreau family pencil business was initially called J. Thoreau and Company. In the late 1840s, after Thoreau had made some of his kind of signal contributions to that business, his father, John Thoreau, changed the name of the family business to J. Thoreau and Son. And that J. Thoreau and Son was the firm name that they stamped into their cedar pencils. And this was the late 1840s when he did this, and there's, from what I can tell, this was expressed more a thank you to his son and a wish that his son Henry would keep working with him than it did any ongoing involvement in Henry's part, because after the family started producing J. Thoreau and Son pencils, Henry doesn't have much to do with the business whatsoever.
J. Thoreau and Son. The boy's identity as an individual is subsumed in the father. Does that subsuming bother Thoreau in any other aspects of life?
Well, there's a really interesting moment that I think speaks to some of Thoreau's reluctance on this particular point. It's a moment in his essay, Civil Disobedience, which is really where I kind of focus a lot of attention on this topic, where Thoreau is trying to explain why he went to jail. He's trying to explain his quarrel with the state. He's trying to set himself up as kind of an ethical exemplar. And to do so, what he says is that this isn't the first time I've done something like this. Right? He says in the essay that there had been a previous occasion when he was asked to contribute to his father's church. And he says he refused to do so. Right. One of what I learned from Bob actually is that there's no evidence that that ever happened. That Thoreau would have been asked to pay a tax to contribute to his father's church, and moreover, there's no reason to put that in the essay other than to mark off his relationship to his father as something that he wasn't really totally on board with. All this, they didn't share the same affiliations. So it was a way to mark himself off from his father, not only in church, but also maybe in business as well.
His father, had he lived they all lived in the 20th century, would have probably done something similar to what I experienced. If you're going to apply to Penn, can't you go to Wharton School? What's with this College of Liberal Arts? And so that tension, I think, was implicitly there. But I want to know, okay, so here's this young man bent on affirming himself and not just the father and the family. He's going to go in his pencil business, and he's going to get caught up in having to source those pencils, the wood, from Florida and the Gulf Coast. And here you are, a reader interested in Thoreau and Emerson and patriarchy and family businesses. How are you walking around with this knowledge about red cedar wood in Florida? Was that owing anything to the fact that you grew up in Maine, where logging and timbering is a major industry?
It has to do with right. So when I began to look into this question of why no one bothered Emerson about his inheritance, and I began to wonder, well, why didn't Thoreau say anything about this, for example? And I began to kind of trace these connections from the pencil business to Florida. It just so happens that I lived in Tampa for a year, and that was a wonderful year. I taught one class per semester. I got a solid 8 hours sleep every night. It was amazing. I had 4-day weekends, during which I would just get in my car and try to drive someplace strange. And in Florida, that's not that difficult to do.
Alligators in your backyard pool.
It's really, I mean, it's a wonderful state. More about that later, though. On one of these trips, this is a true story, I ended up in a place called Cedar Key. Cedar Key is a tiny little island off the Gulf Coast. There's a group of islands off the Gulf Coast that I learned once I arrived there, by happenstance, was the pencil manufacturing capital of the world in the end of the 19th century. It was Eberhard Faber, the German firm, built immense factories there. They also had factories in New York. Eagle Pencil Manufacturing built huge factories there. And what those factories did was process the immense cedar stands that lined the Gulf Coast of Florida into 6-foot cedar slats that were then shipped up to New York to be turned into pencils. So this place, Cedar Key, was basically just churning old growth cedar trees into slats to be made into pencils. And once I started putting the Thoreau pencil story together, I just thought, well, Florida has an interesting history. And it turns out that this island, Cedar Key, the Gulf Coast of Florida, in that part of the state is still a very wild place. It's really one of the most wild stretches of certainly the eastern seaboard. It's very remote, even still. And it was remote then too, and because for that reason, it had been a place of refuge for fugitive slaves. It had been a place of refuge. This is in the first part of the in the last part of the 18th century and the first part of the 19th century. It had been a refuge for indigenous Americans who were seeking to avoid removal. So it was because there was nothing going on there. It wasn't until the cedar stands of the Gulf Coast of Florida became really valuable commodity, timber industry that that part of the Gulf Coast was developed commercially, driving out, of course, all those people who had taken refuge there, which is a history that Thoreau was very opposed to, as we all know, but also complicit in. That's how.
Well, that you never know what you're going to run into.
You never know in Florida. You never know.
Yeah. So, why the pencil business for the Thoreau family? Is this a business you could really get rich in the 1820s and 30s and 40s?
It wasn't a business. It wasn't a business at all in the 1820s, and that was kind of the opportunity. I mean, William Monroe, whose pencil is on display here, was widely considered to be the first kind of large-scale American pencil manufacturer. When he entered the business in 1812, because the war cut off the only source of pencils. And there was no American pencil manufacturing. Monroe, who was a carpenter at the time, saw an opportunity. But he didn't know, when he saw this opportunity, anything whatsoever about making pencils. I mean, this fellow, William Monroe, was a carpenter who was entering the pencil business, and yet so unfamiliar with pencils that he didn't know what wood they were made of. He figured out that it was cedar, and then he went around Concord and looking for cedar. All right? Whereupon he learned that there are actually two varieties of cedar, and they have very different properties, and the one that's most widely available here is white cedar, and not at all appropriate for pencils. This was all something that William Monroe had to learn by doing. He eventually figured out that he couldn't find the wood he needed around here, and he had to look on the wharves of Boston. So he began to scour the wharves for wood that was then called Mobile cedar. Called Mobile cedar because it came from Alabama. It came from Alabama because cedar and cotton love the same soil. So in the process of clearing the land of Alabama for cotton plantations, cedar trees were often cleared and shipped up to Boston. Soon the cedar frontier moved with the cotton frontier to Mississippi. Monroe thought he got a lot of wood from Mississippi also. And then west around the Gulf of Mexico. But that was the only place to get the wood that was needed to make pencils at this time. And it wasn't only just American manufacturers. Like I said, the greatest European manufacturers also in the 1830s and 40s began to rely almost exclusively on Florida cedar, to the extent that when the Civil War cut off the trade in cedar, the biggest pencil manufacturers in the United States and Europe had no idea what to do. They looked everywhere for a substitute. They really didn't know. They looked everywhere, and they couldn't find one. They couldn't find a substitute for the supply of Florida cedar that they had depended on. That's how dominant Florida was in that market.
So one of the questions that I always try to raise for students when you deal with an innovation or a revolution is not what was the new and why people want it, but what was so bad with the old. People in Concord should appreciate that point of view. You know, here, after all, this is the town whose flag should say resisting change since 1775. So, what is, if pencils are new in America, at least newly abundant, what are they replacing?
Right. Well, Thoreau had some experience in this department too. They're replacing quills and inkwells, which were a huge pain for any teacher. When Thoreau was looking for teaching jobs, he wrote to friends to ask them if they knew of any opportunity, anyone who was looking for someone to help fix pens and clean up ink, because the job of the teacher was so dominated by this pen and ink problem. Right? It was once the pencil became more common, thanks to this huge supply of cedar in Florida being brought online. The pencil very quickly took over in classrooms.
So it saved your children's fingers from being cut off by making mistakes.
And the teacher's patience.
Yeah.
But it also played another role in Thoreau's life that was really important and consequential. And as Laura Wall's biography points out, the pencil allowed Thoreau to be the kind of writer that he wanted to be, not only by subsidizing his career, but also because it let him take his work outside. It let him write outside. No place for an inkwell, the woods.
And Thoreau made his career as a writer on pencils, unlike Washington Irving's figure, Geoffrey Crayon. Right? So let's jump ahead and note one thing. All these distinguished biographers, historians, including me, have written about Thoreau and the pencil business, the Monroes, and focused so heavily on the technological challenge of pounding that graphite and mixing it with clay and getting a mixture that could be encased in pencils. They did this so well, so thoroughly, that they never thought about the wooden casing. They thought only about the mixture that gave you the lead. And I guess the reason must be that Thoreau was involved with the technological innovations, and he didn't mention the wooden casings. So historians and biographers get trapped by their sources. If Thoreau didn't mention the wooden casings, the historians and the biographers are not going to mention it. And you were sort of wise guy enough to say, how come he didn't mention it? So the question is, you got at least this big silence here. The Thoreau pencils depended on red cedar, at least hypothetically, but we don't have any documents to prove it. Instead, what we have are writings about slavery, in which wood appears pretty frequently in the rhetoric. So could you tell us a little bit about how you interpret these speeches, and what's your literary method of interpretation other than gotcha with the wood?
Right. Well, this is a very interesting question. First of all, because Bob's 100% right. The Thoreaus had the best pencil business in the United States in the 1840s. Literally no records survive from their business, which is amazing. Now, why is that? John Thoreau was notoriously secretive about his business, and there were surely a number of reasons for that. Right? Concord was a pencil town. Right? At one point, I think there were 14 pencil manufacturers in this town. And John Thoreau was well aware of the risks that went along with that, in part because, as Bob has pointed out, he stole someone else's secrets to get a start himself. Right? So he certainly wouldn't have wanted that to happen to him in reverse. At the same time, there were certainly records somewhere at some point. What became of those? The Thoreau family were dedicated abolitionists who were very interested in being seen as kind of sophisticated and civilized and cultured, and their family records were ultimately, given to the Concord Public Library by Henry's last surviving sibling, his younger sister, right, Sophia, and who herself was a very dedicated abolitionist who had an interest in not preserving this part of the family's record, if any record ever existed. So the silence is really extraordinary and does beg some interpretation. At the same time, I think that Thoreau did write about pencils. And there's one instance in particular that I think is quite notable. This is in Civil Disobedience. As I mentioned, a kind of focus of this essay because it precisely involves Thoreau taking a stand against the expansion of the United States around the Gulf of Mexico. In other words, through Cedar Country. So in the middle of Civil Disobedience, we all know that it's about a guy who went to jail to stand up for what he believed in and against his government. Yes, and it's also about Thoreau developing this kind of set of ethical standards, this kind of way of thinking about what it would mean to act ethically. He works through a series of kind of considerations and propositions about ethical behavior, and where he lands is here. He says that the ultimate ethical principle has to be that if I have wrested a plank from a drowning man, I must restore it, even if I drown myself. If I have wrested a plank from a drowning man, I must restore it, even though I may drown myself. In other words, his metaphor for ill-gotten gains, for justice, for repair, is lumber. It's a plank. It's wood. Now, I think that this is not an accident. He is someone who's trying to make sense of what to do about his family's ill-gotten gains in lumber, which came from the Gulf of Mexico by writing this essay about ill-gotten gains originating around the Gulf of Mexico. And there are a number of other instances like this where he's writing about wood as a metaphor for injustice. So we have to ask, though, why did Thoreau not write about pencils and slavery more directly? And I actually think this is one of the things that most interests me about this topic, because I actually think that this is one way in which Thoreau is absolutely representative and typical and just average, ordinary guy. I mean, I drove 200 miles in an SUV to get to an Earth Day forum.
Did you pick up any hitchhikers along the way?
No, I did nothing. I've bought no carbon offsets. I've done nothing. Would I like to have an electric car? Yes, I very much would like to have an electric car, but they're very expensive. Now, I have a 6-year-old son. He seems to want to eat, a number of times every day, and that's very expensive. And we all make these calculations. And if I were to buy an electric car, and feed him, then I would be up, a creek. So we all make these calculations every day, without specifically articulating our implication in the processes that we're trying to calculate some way through. Right? And I think that you could even argue that you can make a case that this question is one of the most important questions in modern history. It's like, if you want to be a good person, right, what do you do about bad things? And that, I think, to an unrecognized extent, that was Thoreau's question. He was trying to work through that. And his answer, by the way, is not go live in the woods by yourself. That was one thing that he tried, maybe. And his answer is not go to jail. That was one thing that he tried. But those were just two versions of attempts to get to an answer to this bigger question.
Let me ask you a quick question, and then I'm going to move us in a way that will open up for questions and answers.
Great.
Quick question is, well, in 1840, Henry David Thoreau, along with his brother and sisters and parents, signed a petition to the Massachusetts legislature calling on it to oppose the admission of Florida to the Union as a slave state. What manufacturer of pencils concerned about sources would have turned down the land of his sources from entering the Union?
The whole family signed it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So why were they, if that Florida as the source of red cedar was so important, why would you want to keep it out of the Union?
I think that this is not a contradiction. I think that they were both committed to the pencil business and the abolitionist cause. I think this is a really important point because we're not, it's not about the story's not about hypocrisy. It's not about exposing Thoreau. It's not about canceling Thoreau. It's about illustrating how complicated these questions are. How complicated it is to find a way through bad systems to good action. And it's not, they could hold both of those priorities at once, and I think that's what really makes it a representative story.
I think there are two other things. One, I realized as I was asking the question, Florida is still a territory of the United States. It's not a foreign land the way Texas might have been as an independent republic. So they'd still get the source.
Not going to lose access.
Yes, we're not going to lose access. But the other thing I think is that by the late 1830s, 1840s, a common abolitionist strategy was to denounce the sin of slaveholding. That's one thing. And slaveholders as sinners. And to expose individual slaveholders as immoral people. Now, that strategy becomes impossible to sustain if you're open in public about your own slaveholding forebears and your own complicity. So that in some ways the silence enables your complicity and it allows you to denounce slaveholders as sinners without being exposed as a hypocrite. But the broader theme that you're developing here, which is really pertinent for Earth Day, is to emphasize how much just living in the world of capitalism that we do makes us complicit. Everybody with your cell phones and the rare earth minerals on which they're based. And I wonder if you could reflect a little bit for us on how it is that extractive industries, coal and oil and graphite and rare earth and iron and steel, rare earth minerals, why have they so often come to represent the worst excesses of capitalism and exploitation of labor forces and the like? Have you thought about that?
Never once. Never once. The interesting thing is, the amazing thing about those industries is how diffuse they are, right? How hard they are to get outside of. And what permits them to be so central to our lives that we can't act outside of them? I think that has more to do with how we understand ourselves than it does with the particular structure of those industries. It has more to do with our own priorities than theirs. You know, we think about ourselves as having to do this or having to do that and having to get gas in Connecticut in order to make it to Concord, and those are the terms on which we interact with those horrifically extractive and oppressive and terrible industries that will be the end of us all, for sure. But we don't interact with them on those terms. We interact with them on much more mundane terms. And I think that's part of Thoreau's value here, right? Is that going to Walden is an attempt to reject those terms of necessity.
He says the only true America is that land in which a man can live, feed himself, clothe himself, in freedom, without the state getting a purchase on him and making him have to support slavery and war. Thoreau wanted to model a way of living that wouldn't necessarily free you from complicity, but would limit as much as you could the ways in which your way of life contributed to the oppression of other people. And the problem, of course, is, as you're laying out, is that when the division of labor extends across such wide terrain that producers in one place and consumers in another are invisible to one another, then it's very, very difficult to figure out what your responsibilities are. We could say, I think, that, I don't think the people who built Stonehenge had a lot of willing volunteers to move those stones. I don't think the people who built the pyramids, especially during Passover week, we might recall, were volunteering. That in much of world history, the great monuments we look at must have been erected by coerced labor. And so we might want to turn in some ways to the modern world and say, well, new standards were invented at the same time as modernity. And while the standards don't have to make us sit around and feel guilty, they can at least summon us to want to act better. So maybe we should open this up to questions from all of you. You can tell us how you act better.
You can ask the questions through the microphone online here.
Yes.
I just wanted to remind us all that moral sensitivity is an evolving process, both for the individual and for the society. And we are going through, we have seen in my lifetime, and I've lived quite a long time, movements against injustice of various kinds rise and slowly sink into public consciousness until there's an active movement. And I think we have to remember that that process was happening in Concord and elsewhere against slavery, and that Thoreau was born in 1817, and that the process was slowly evolving while they were making their pencils.
Right.
And their own consciousness had to evolve over the years, Thoreau's too. And just be wary of not shaking our fingers at a different time and a different process.
Yeah, precisely not. I think what this story emphasizes is really that it's much more subtle and dynamic and conflicted than the question of slavery and abolition are usually, the line between slavery and abolition is usually drawn. It not only involved them coming into consciousness of what was wrong out there, but also kind of, as Bob implied, turning against their interests as business owners and arguably as a family. So how do you, if you come to oppose slavery while this is the thing that your family business ultimately rests on, well, that's a really interesting process. It's not whatsoever about an abstract concept of justice, but a very kind of one that's very close to home, actually. And that's it's a really difficult place to arrive.
Yeah, right over there.
Thank you so much for the wonderful talk, and Bob for the great questions. And what strikes me is you just opened up a really wonderful window into Thoreau as an incredibly good student of capitalism at a time when it's really just taking shape. And I'm struck by the move in that family business from their uncle stumbling across a graphite mine in New Hampshire, which is such a local, small-scale way of building a small-scale industry. And they end up by processing graphite and selling it off to the New York market for the printing presses.
Right.
That's a lot of change in a lifetime.
Yes.
And I'm thinking about his decision to go to Walden, and then I've been teaching the essay Huckleberries this past semester a couple times, as Thoreau's answer is not to take down capitalism and all its complicity, but try to imagine some other system which is almost impossible to do. Like you read Huckleberries and his vision of people living off of wild fruits, and it can't really happen, but you have to imagine it. And I think that push and pull between what he lived and what he was trying to imagine and dream, what you can write with those pencils to write against the process of pencils, is a really powerful takeaway.
Yeah, thank you very much. That's right. His answer evolved. It went through iterations and evolved over time. And I this project has really, asked me to kind of come back and trace out the evolution of his thinking on precisely this issue. And where he arrives in, a plea for John Brown is very different from the Thoreau that gets taught in Walden, right? That where he arrives in a plea for John Brown is with a kind of a vision of collective action. The subject of that essay is what are we going to do, right? Whereas before, he's known, in such classes as Emerson and Thoreau, Individualism and American Culture, he's known as a writer of I.
Well, thank you. I have a rather mundane question, and the answer may be somewhere in the museum. If there were a dozen or more pencil manufacturers all competing in Concord, how were they competing against each other? And did they use steam power, water power? What were the bases of competition then?
I don't think they were all competing. They didn't all have their own line of pencils. They were all they all knew how to do it. They maybe made pencils on different scales for different markets. They maybe were, William Monroe's business was very large. I mean, at one point, William Monroe had 20 tons of cedar in his backyard, which is just a huge amount of wood. And so he probably subcontracted parts of his business to others. And they didn't all have their own proprietary pencils that they retailed.
I could add a little bit. There was a Concord Steam Mill Corporation, which was chartered in about 1845, 46. It was right on what is Wood Wharf Lane, now Cottage Lane, off of Main Street. And it was built right around if you walk on Wood Wharf Lane, Cottage Lane, you'll get to the railroad tracks. And that's where it was. And they did work for pencil making in that steam mill. I looked today at my records. No record of the Thoreaus using it, but I bet they did because it was so close to where the Thoreau house is. It burned to the ground in 1848. So even when they tried to take advantage of modernity, this happened in a lot of ways in Concord, a fire would destroy each effort. But I thought you were going to ask a different question, and want to be sure that we get this into the discussion. There's no smoking gun, no document. We can't prove that the Thoreau family got red cedar for its pencils. But we have pencils, and they can be tested today. And Augustine is working on a project to fund the lab testing. The most perfect combination of humanities scholarship pointing the way to the scientific analysis that will lead to a fresh interpretation of the humanities and the politics of pencil making.
Right. It's really, the politics is the key word there. Where this points, if you test the pencils, what you'll find is that they came from what is now the district of Representative Matt Gaetz. and it's one thing if Florida doesn't want to teach African American studies or whatever, but how are you going to teach Emerson and Thoreau if you don't teach African American studies?
Well, he's never used a pencil in his life. He's just a TV camera.
Probably so.
Could I just follow up on the graphite? Again, as you said, the documents, the records aren't there in part because Thoreau would take the records and turn them over and write notes on the back in the field. The Morgan Library has some wonderful examples of that. But you're right, the records aren't there. So I've been wondering about that moment. The Thoreau family got into graphite, not pencils. And Laura Walls indicates that it's Elizabeth Peabody who tipped Thoreau off on that. And I think early enough that it may have been Thoreau graphite that was used in the stereotype edition of the first edition of Uncle Tom's Cabin. The advantage of graphite is when you're electroplating the set, the set type, you get a mold, then you can just make as many types as you want, or type blocks as you want, put them as many presses as you have your whole edition out overnight and so on. Wonderful, great improvement. But it's just an impression, but I think the Thoreaus might have gotten out of the actual hold it in your hand pencil making business pretty early on. And the only reason that might have any significance is exactly the sorts of debates you're talking about. When did Thoreau write this? What was the family business doing then? And it's not a question that's readily answerable, but at some point, those late records that do survive, it's for graphite, it's not for pencils.
Right.
And I would too say about how they made them, William Monroe's two journeymen made 1 million pencils in 1 year in a 10 by 12 foot space using hand tools.
1 million. Yeah.
So you don't need a steam mill to make pencils.
Yeah. Well, that's a great point. I don't have the citation, but I've seen they started doing the graphite in around 1849, based on what I've seen. The last time they made pencils, as far as what I've seen, the actual hold in your hand pencil was 1853, right? And which, it is the beginning of a kind of Thoreau taking a much more radical stand against slavery. That's the same year as slavery in Massachusetts. Right? The dates, it's impossible to say for sure for all sorts of reasons, but there is some alignment of the dates there. Now, a question for you: why do you think that about Uncle Tom's Cabin? That's an amazing connection.
Oh, because it says on the title page, the stereotype edition.
But why the Thoreau graphite? Because that was the only graphite.
Place to get it.
Amazing. Yeah.
Around here. I mean, Elizabeth Peabody learned about it somewhere, but it's speculation. I don't know. But seeing that it's a stereotype edition, that takes graphite. Well, I know somebody who makes graphite. Don't know.
Interesting.
Well, I think that's our
I think
time.
our time is up. Well, let's thank Augustine for bringing the fruits of his research to us and simultaneously challenging all of us to think about how we live.